Moana. After Ella, Edric and I went to the outdoor painting class together. It started to become more and more apparent to me that Ella was deeply craving more interactions with other children her age. With each passing day, she begged me more and more to bring her to the orphanage to play with the other children, and began to grow a little defiant when Edric told her that she couldn't be going out all of the time. My years of working with children and my career in early childhood education taught me that one of the most important things for any child to experience was socializing with other children. Ella had been mostly cooped up her entire life, and I even began to honestly wonder if she even had any interactions with other children before I came into the picture. Maybe she ran into children at training or saw her little cousins once or twice a year during family gatherings, but she didn't have consistent chances to socialize with other kids. I saw the toll it was taking on her, and as the days ticked closer to the beginning of the school year, I could tell that Ella was deeply upset. Finally, I decided to talk to Edric about the possibility of sending Ella to school. I knew that he would likely be hesitant about the idea, so I decided to prepare first. I began to do some research on local private schools and even spent a few days just spending all of my free time compiling a list of the best local private schools for Edric to look at. I made sure to find schools with plenty of extracurriculars for Ella to get involved in, and also made sure to find schools that offered pre-kindergarten through high school so that she could stay with her friends, as I was certain that she was bound to make a lot of friends. After several days of searching, I finally compiled a list of schools that I was certain would pique Edric's interest. How could he say no to sending his little girl to such nice schools? Surely he would at least go on some tours and think about it. In fact, there was even one school that was within walking distance of the penthouse. It was an all-girls school that had been around for a long time, and judging from the pictures that I found online, it looked beautiful. Later that evening, after I had the list and an entire little speech ready for Edric, I waited patiently for Edric to come home. When I heard the elevator doors open, I immediately jumped up from the armchair in the living room and scurried over to Edric. "Let me take your coat," I said, quickly taking his suit jacket off of his arm. I took his briefcase next and set everything aside with a smile. Edric shot me a strange, confused look as I hung up his coat and let out a low chuckle. "What's all this for?" he asked lightheartedly. "Are you trying to butter me up or something?" I shook my head at first and guided him over to the dining room table. I pulled a chair out for him, then ran into the kitchen and returned with a covered tray of food that I had kept hot, knowing that he would be at work late that evening. When I set it down in front of him, he laughed again and made my face go red. "Moana, this is very nice, but what on earth is going on?" Edric asked. "Did someone die? Are you finally trying to poison me?" "No," I replied sheepishly, feeling my face get even more hot as I fiddled nervously with the front of my dress. "Well, maybe I'm trying to butter you up a little." Edric raised an eyebrow but uncovered his plate regardless and began to stab the steaming pasta with his fork. He seemed to be in good humor that evening, which gave me more confidence about bringing up such a sensitive topic. "What is it?" I cleared my throat, then produced the pamphlet of potential schools that I had folded up in my pocket. "I think Ella really needs to start socializing more with other children," I said. "She's getting older, and she's hardly had any opportunities to meet other kids. It's taking an obvious toll on her, as I'm sure you've noticed lately." Edric, who was about to put a forkful of pasta in his mouth, froze and looked up at me with somewhat wide eyes. "Are you suggesting—" He set his fork down. I nodded. "Ella needs to go to school." Edric's face went cold, and he said nothing. Seeing him react like this was a bit disheartening, but it wasn't unexpected. I had spent days preparing for this. I set the pamphlet down on the table in front of him and sat down at the table. "I know you're unsure about sending her to school, but I've been doing a lot of research and I found quite a few nice private schools in the area," I said, trying my best to come across as compassionate and gentle. I understood why sending his little girl away to school after she lived cooped up in the penthouse for the past 8 years was difficult, but at the same time, I knew that I was at least half right. I slid the pamphlet closer to him, and although he just stared down at it silently, I kept talking. I really think you should at least just take a look, I said. Please. Edric was silent for several moments. He seemed stiff and almost seemed as though he would get up and walk away at any moment, but then he finally picked up the pamphlet and slightly flipped through it. I'll consider it, he said. His voice was cold, and he stood abruptly without eating his dinner. Without another word, he started off toward his study. Panicking and worrying that I had put him off somehow, I jumped up and called after him. Edric, I know it's scary to send her out into the world, and I know that you're worried about her getting hurt or the paparazzi scaring her, but she needs this more than you realize, I said. Edric paused, his back still turned to me, but he did seem to be listening. Think about everything that Ella is missing out on. She needs friends, new experiences. She needs to learn things that she wouldn't otherwise be able to learn about while being homeschooled, and she needs more than a one-on-one experience in life if you want her to be successful when she grows up. Edric stood there for a few moments. I could tell that he was thinking about it, and that he wasn't just ignoring me or waiting for me to be quiet. And although he still walked into his office without saying anything, I couldn't help but smile. I was pretty certain that my words struck a chord with him. Above all else, I knew that he cared deeply about Ella's future and her happiness, and I knew that he wouldn't want her to live her life being cooped up and separated from society. At least, that was assuming that what Olivia told me wasn't true. Edric, when Moana brought up the idea of sending Ella to school all of a sudden, I felt my blood run cold. The thought of sending Ella away every day, where anything horrible could have happened to her, made me feel sick. Throughout the entire 8 years so far of her existence, I had done such a good job of keeping her safe and away from the public eye. Even when I announced her existence to the news, I knew that I would eventually have to start bringing her to public events along with Moana, but I still didn't think that I would ever send her to school. I had plenty of money to hire the best tutors for her, and her education so far was excellent. But at the same time, I knew that Moana was right to an extent. School wasn't just about learning. It was also about children being given the chance to socialize, form bonds with other children, and get exposed to different types of people and different environments. Even then, I still wasn't sure if I could bring myself to let her go. Between my father, Ella's mother, and the paparazzi, I was terrified about the idea of sending her to school. I initially tossed Moana's pamphlet down on my desk and chose to ignore it. And I did a good job of ignoring it at first, as I got some work done on my computer, but after a while it was almost as though the pamphlet was inching its way closer into my field of vision, taunting me, begging me to look at it. And finally, with a sigh, I decided to flip through it. What was the harm in that, right? As I flipped through it, it immediately became apparent that Moana had put quite a lot of work into her research. She had pictures of each school, their locations, the names of their principals, reviews taken from the internet, and a lot of other information. That alone was what kept me flipping, and soon enough, I looked up at the clock to realize that I had spent almost half an hour thoroughly reading through information on 15 different schools without even noticing how much time had passed. However, none of the schools piqued my interest. They were all either too far, not good enough for my daughter, or didn't have the right extracurriculars. Maybe I was just being too harsh, and I was just looking for reasons to hate the schools. Either way, I decided not to choose any of them. Moana and Ella would be understandably upset, but I could make up for it. I could take Ella to a summer club with other children, or find her some friends who could come over for playdates. But that wouldn't be good enough. I knew that, and I only ever wanted Ella to be happy and healthy and to have plenty of opportunities in her life. I didn't want to be the reason that she felt cooped up all her life, and I especially didn't want her feeling bitter toward me about it when she grew up. So, biting my lip, I decided to give the pamphlet yet another look. As I scoured the pamphlet for a second time, it turned out that there was actually one school that piqued my interest after all. It was an all-girls private school. When I looked at the address, I realized that I recognized the street it was on. It was only a few blocks away, so it was within walking distance and was still in the nice part of town. In fact, I recalled having passed it quite a few times since living here, and I knew how nice it was. It was an old building with tall windows and plenty of space outside. I remembered walking past on multiple occasions and seeing the children playing on a fenced-in playground while teachers watched them. Not only that, but it offered pre-kindergarten all the way through high school, which meant that Ella would never need to switch schools so long as we continued living at the penthouse. Honestly, it was the perfect school. But I still didn't want my daughter to go. Suddenly, as I sat there with my head in my hands as I tried and failed to come up with an alternative to sending Ella to school, I heard a knock on the door. Before I could even answer, the door cracked open and Selena's head popped in. "You didn't eat your dinner." I glanced up at the clock. It was after 9 o'clock at night. I simply shrugged. I wasn't hungry. Selena frowned and came in, revealing a tray of food in her hands. It was a cup of tea and a slice of toast with jam, and as she came closer, I realized that I was actually hungry now. I thanked her when she set the tray down and expected her to leave after that, but to no surprise, the old housekeeper looked down at my desk and made a humph sound. "Schools?" she asked, picking up the pamphlet before I could snatch it away. The old housekeeper was always like this. She was more like a mother to me, or maybe an aunt, than an actual housekeeper. Not that I ever would have admitted that to her. Sort of," I replied with a shrug as I took a bite of my toast, trying to act nonchalant. "I doubt I'll pick one." Selena's frown deepened as she looked up at me. "Why not?" "Ella would love to go to school." I froze for a moment, unsure of what to say. Selena looked back down at the pamphlet with the page open to the school that was down the street and suddenly smiled. "I went to this school," she exclaimed. "I loved it here. Oh, I wonder if the headmistress is still there. She'd be too old by now, I suppose." I hated to admit it, but the housekeeper's excitement made my heart beat a little faster. Hearing that she went to that school and that she loved it relieved some of my anxiety and softened me toward the concept of Ella going. I chewed and swallowed my toast, then looked up at her and watched as she set the pamphlet back down and made her way back toward the door. "Do you think she'd like it there too?" I asked. Selena stopped, thinking for a moment, then turned back to look at me with a smile on her aging face. She nodded. "She would love it," she said. "And I would love to see her finally going to school. Every child deserves to go." Without another word, Selena walked out of the room after that and left me alone. I felt awful now for not giving Ella the chance earlier to go to school, and that made me come to a conclusion. Moana and Selena were right. Ella did deserve to go to school if she wanted to go. Maybe it wouldn't hurt just to go and take a look, I thought to myself. And so, the following morning, I found Moana and Ella sitting at the breakfast table. "Get dressed, both of you," I said. "We're going to look at a school today." Moana. Both Ella's and my eyes widened when Edric came out into the dining room early the next morning and announced his plans. "Get dressed, both of you," he said. "We're going to look at a school today." Ella's jaw dropped. "A school?" she shrieked, jumping up from her chair excitedly. "Really?" Edric nodded with a slight smile. "Yep, we're going to look into sending you to school like all of the other kids. Would you like that?" With a wide, ecstatic grin, Ella nodded vehemently and ran over to her father. She threw her little arms around his legs and hugged him tightly. "Yes, Daddy," she shouted. "I really, really want to go to school." Ella's excitement made me smile, and I could tell that Edric was trying and failing to hide a smile of his own. "Go get dressed, then," he said. "We don't have a lot of time. I told the headmistress we'd be there soon." Ella took off at a full sprint toward her room. I thought I heard the sound of her tripping, falling, and skidding across the floor on her way, but she seemed fine. I stood, smiling, and placed my hands on my hips. "So you really did think about it, huh?" I asked. Edric shrugged. "You were right. Ella does belong in school, and she deserves to socialize with other kids. Besides, with the baby coming, having her at school during the day will be a good thing for you." I didn't necessarily agree with that last point. I was confident that I could easily handle both a baby and Ella on my own, so long as I had just a little help. but I wasn't about to argue with Edric. I was just glad that he had decided to send Ella to school after all. It was about time that she had a chance to make friends, try new experiences, and learn new things in a classroom setting. After quickly getting dressed and helping Ella get ready, the three of us headed downstairs. It turned out that Edric chose the school that was within walking distance, which made me happy. And so we walked to meet the headmistress. Ella walked between us, holding one of each of our hands, and it really did feel like we were a little family. The walk was nice too, and I imagined that I would enjoy walking Ella to school every morning. When we arrived, the school was just as lovely as the pictures. It was an old building with tall windows, stone facades, and arched wooden doors. There was a playground out front with lots of shade from trees and plenty of playground equipment, and there was even a garden on the other side with planter boxes for fruit and vegetables. As we walked up the long pebble pathway to the front door, an elderly woman stepped out onto the front stoop and waved to us. She had long white hair that was piled into a neat bun on top of her head and wore an elegant suit jacket with a matching pencil skirt. As we approached, I saw that she had the school emblem, a golden crown, embroidered onto the lapel of her jacket. "Good morning," the old woman said with a bright smile. "You must be Mr. Morgan, Miss Ella," and she turned toward me, pausing and waiting for me to introduce myself. "Moana," I replied, holding out my hand. The old woman shook it with a smile. "I'm Headmistress Hawkins," she replied, then turned and held open the heavy wooden door for us. "Come on in, let's start your tour." Headmistress Hawkins was a spry woman for her age and scurried around the school with ease as she showed us everything. The inside of the school was even more lovely, with tile floors, high ceilings, and a lot of natural light. There was a gymnasium, auditorium, countless classrooms, a cafeteria, a beautiful inner courtyard with a fountain, and plenty of recreation spaces. She showed us the music room, the science lab, the daycare room, and the library, and before we knew it, we had spent well over an hour just touring the entire school. "And this is the art room," the headmistress said, gesturing to a closed and rather dusty-looking door. Well, it was the art room. I furrowed my brow and peered in through the window on the door to see a large, dark room with all of the furniture covered by white sheets. The curtains were closed, and there were boxes everywhere, as though it was being used for storage. "Is it not being used?" I asked, turning to face the headmistress. She sighed and nodded. "I'm afraid our art program isn't what it used to be," she replied, "and by that I mean that it's non-existent right now." I frowned. What happened? Headmistress Hawkins let out another sigh and lowered her voice a bit. "Our beloved art teacher passed away a couple of years ago," she said. "She was getting on in age. We haven't found a good enough replacement, so unfortunately our art department is currently on hold." Hearing that the art department was non-existent now put a bit of a damper on my opinion of the school. Of course, it was out of the headmistress's control, but I wanted to make sure that Ella went to a school with a good art program, and now I wasn't so sure if this would be the right fit. Suddenly, however, Ella spoke up. "Moana is a really good art teacher," she exclaimed, causing my face to go red. Headmistress Hawkins raised her eyebrows. "Oh," she asked, looking at me. "You're a teacher?" I shook my head and blushed an even deeper shade of red. "No. Well, not really. I do have my degree in childhood education, but I only really teach art at an orphanage downtown. I don't know if I would really call it teaching experience." Ella frowned and folded her little arms across her chest. Sometimes she really did look like a little adult, and right now was one of those times. "But you're the best teacher ever," she said. "She even taught my daddy how to paint, and he's a terrible artist." I stifled a laugh and looked up at Edric. He was still silent, but when he looked down at me, I could tell from the look in his eyes that we were thinking the same thing. I wondered at that moment if I should apply for the position of the art teacher here. I didn't have any real teaching experience, but I did go to school for it. And if it had been years since they had found a teacher who was a good fit for the role, then what was the harm in applying? "Well, do let me know if you'd like to apply." Headmistress Hawkins said with a smile as we continued the tour, "I'd love to look at your resume, if you're interested, of course." As we continued the tour, I couldn't help but wonder if it would be good for me to apply. I had always wanted to be an art teacher after all, and this would be the perfect place. I could be there for Ella all day if anything happened, and Edric wouldn't have to worry anymore. Every day, I could walk with her to school and walk home with her. And as I looked up at Edric and he met my gaze, I knew that he was having the same thoughts. Moana. When we were finished with the tour, we stopped in the downstairs foyer. Headmistress Hawkins smiled at us, her brown eyes radiating with kindness. "Well," she asked, "what do you think?" I looked over at Edric expectantly. He was fairly quiet throughout the entire tour, only occasionally asking questions. I was a bit worried that he wouldn't like it and that he would make up some excuse to say no, but much to my surprise, he looked down at Ella with a gentle smile. "It's up to you, Ella," he said. "Do you like this school?" Ella nodded excitedly. "I really like it here," she said, squeezing Edric's hand tightly. "I really want to go to school here." Edric smiled and looked up at the headmistress. "Well, I guess that's that," he said with a bit of a chuckle. Headmistress Hawkins grinned. "Perfect," she replied. "Let's get you enrolled." That day, we got Ella enrolled in school. The school year would begin in just a few short weeks, which was fairly short notice, but I knew that Edric would make sure that Ella was prepared. Later that evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I simply couldn't stop beaming over the fact that Edric was going to let Ella start going to school. Ella hadn't stopped talking about it all day, and even getting her to sleep was a battle because she was so excited. It made me feel warm inside to see her get so excited over school. And I was glad that Edric had made the right decision after all. Even though I knew that this would be difficult for him, I was certain that it would be the best thing for everybody in the long run. However, that wasn't the only thing that was on my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about that empty art classroom. It was important for any child to have access to a good art program in school, and it made me sad to think that the children at that school had been without a proper art program for years, since the last art teacher passed away. Ella loved that school and wanted to go there so badly, and it was the perfect place for her to go, but it made me uneasy to think that she would be without a proper art class for the foreseeable future. Sure, I could give her some art lessons and make sure that she had time to be creative when she was home, but it wasn't fair for the other students to not have that luxury. And when I came out of the bathroom after my shower, drying my hair with a towel, I could tell instantly from the thoughtful look on Edric's face that he was dealing with an internal dilemma as well. He was leaning on the balcony railing and looking out over the city, and when I came out, he looked over his shoulder at me with a strange expression on his face. "You're thinking about something," I said, walking up to him. "What is it?" Edric shrugged and didn't answer for a few moments, but I knew what he was thinking about. He was worried about Ella. He didn't like the idea of sending her to school every day. "You're worried about her." Edric nodded hesitantly. "I guess so," he replied, almost as though he didn't want to admit that he actually had a soft side. I sighed and leaned on the balcony railing next to him. The city was bustling as always, and it would never stop. Even though the walk to Ella's new school wasn't very far and was a nice walk in a safe neighborhood, it was still the city, after all. Anything could happen, and I understood why Edric was scared. Even the paparazzi alone were bad enough, not including the danger of cars and people with bad intentions. Ella was still little, and she would of course need to be chaperoned both to and from school until she was at least a few years older. But I also knew that having her away from the penthouse during the day, when anything could happen, was terrifying for a father who had always kept his daughter cooped up. "She's smart," I said gently. "You don't need to worry so much, and it's in a safe neighborhood, and she'll be surrounded by teachers and staff all day." Edric was silent for a few moments before licking his lips and answering. "Teachers and staff can be dangerous too," he replied. His words made my heart sink. He wasn't wrong. Bad things happened in schools all of the time, but it didn't mean that he should spend the rest of his life worrying. For all we knew, someone could have walked into the penthouse right then and there and killed all of us. I thought back to the open art teacher position once more. I did, after all, have a degree in early childhood education with a concentration in art therapy. I did also have some teaching experience thanks to the orphanage. Maybe I should apply, I said. Then I can be with Ella all day in case something happens. You won't need to worry anymore. Edric froze, then slowly turned to look at me. I knew that he had been thinking the same thing when we were touring the school together earlier that day, but it seemed as though he didn't think that I would actually be serious about applying. "Are you sure?" he asked, gesturing lightly toward my growing belly. "Won't it be too much for you, especially later on in the pregnancy?" I shrugged. "The baby is strong," I replied, thinking back to everything that happened with the rogues. "I'm not worried. I might need a little extra help at home since I'll be working every day, but it's not like taking care of Ella is a chore in the slightest. Besides, with Ella at school, I won't have much to do during the day anymore. I've always wanted to be an art teacher." "What about when the baby comes?" he asked. "Won't it be stressful to start working and then have to take maternity leave just a few months later?" I shook my head. "I'm not worried. I have Selena and the maids, and I have you, and don't forget that they do have a daycare center." Edric chewed his lip for a moment. "I guess you're right. I'm sorry if it seems like I'm trying to talk you out of it. I'm just worried about you." Without thinking, I reached over on the railing and touched Edric's hand. He didn't pull away, and instead wrapped his fingers around mine gently. I couldn't tell if it was intentional on his part or not, but it made my heart race a bit either way. "If it would make you happy, I think you should do it," Edric said quietly, his steely blue eyes meeting mine. I slept on it that night, thinking that I should take my time to make my decision before I jumped into anything. But when I woke up the next morning, I simply couldn't get it off of my mind. Edric went to work, and finally I couldn't contain it anymore. So after asking Selena to keep an eye on Ella for a while, I printed out a copy of my resume and marched down to the school. I swallowed the nervous knot in my throat as I knocked on the door to Headmistress Hawkins' office. "Oh, Mona," she said with a beaming smile when she saw me. "Is that—" She pointed at the resume in my hand. I nodded and held it out for her. "I'd like to apply for the position after all," I said with a smile. Headmistress Hawkins took the papers. I felt my heart start to race as she looked over it, the inner voice in my head telling me that she wouldn't hire me because she thought that I was a human. But, much to my surprise, she looked up at me and grinned. "I'll call your reference today," she said. "I'm so glad you decided to apply." That day, I went home with a big smile on my face. Moana. After I handed the headmistress of Ella's new school my resume, I went home with a big smile on my face. Even if I didn't wind up getting the job due to my lack of teaching experience, this was still a step in the right direction. After spending years being unable to get decent jobs due to my low status as a human, it seemed as though potential employers might start actually taking me seriously. I knew that most of it had to do with the fact that I was now publicly Edric's fiancée, but I didn't care. To me, it was still a win. As the day went on, however, I went from excited to downright nervous. Every time I started to think about it, knowing that the headmistress may have been talking to Sophia for my reference at any moment, I felt my heart start to race. I tried to stay calm, but this combination of excitement and nervousness made it incredibly difficult to focus on anything else that day. By the evening, I still hadn't heard back. I didn't expect to hear back for at least another day, but it still made me feel even more worried. What if the headmistress simply never responded to my application? It was a terribly common practice for employers to never respond to applications, and despite the fact that Ella would be a student at that school in just a few weeks, I suppose that I wasn't immune to that. I just hoped that wouldn't be the case. Eventually, Edric came home from work. I was sitting on the sofa in the living room and trying to read when I heard the whir of the elevator doors opening. "Daddy!" Ella yelled, jumping up and running over to him excitedly. I heard the sound of her kissing him on the cheek, followed by Edric's voice as he asked her how her day was. Ella seemed to be whispering something to him, and a few moments later, the alpha billionaire walked into the living room with Ella in his arms. "Ella told me that you're waiting for something special news," Edric said to me. raising an eyebrow. "What is it?" I felt my face go red. I hadn't planned on saying anything unless I got the job, but I should have known that Ella would spill the news as soon as possible. She was only 8 after all, and it was a bit naive of me to think that she was capable of keeping a secret for more than 5 minutes. I swallowed and set down my book, then nervously fiddled with my braid. I applied for the art teacher position this morning. The headmistress said that she would call Sophia, my reference. Edric's face went from stoic to surprised, but I couldn't help but notice that there was a bit of a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Oh, did you?" he said, setting Ella down. "I can't wait for Moana to be my real teacher," Ella exclaimed. "Then we can go to school together every day." Edric smiled a bit, and despite my nervousness, even I couldn't help but smile at Ella's excitement. Edric then sent Ella to her room to get ready for dinner, and when he turned back to me, I could sense a bit of worry in his eyes. I couldn't tell if he was hoping that I would get the job or hoping that I wouldn't get the job. "Have you heard back yet?" he asked once we were alone again. I shook my head and bit my lip. "No, probably not until tomorrow at Lee." Suddenly, as if on cue, my phone began to buzz on the coffee table. I fell silent, my eyes widening when I saw the unsaved number on my phone. No one except for Sophia ever called me, and I had her name saved in my phone. Unless this was a scam call, it had to be the headmistress. "Well?" Edric asked, noticing my hesitation. "Aren't you going to answer it?" I nodded sheepishly. My hand shook as I picked up my phone and tapped on the screen to answer it, and it took all of my strength not to sound nervous. "Hello," I answered. "Is this Moana?" "It's Headmistress Hawkins." My eyes widened even further, and I stood involuntarily. "Yes," I replied, eyeing Edric as he watched me expectantly. "Moana, I called your reference," the headmistress said. "She was lovely and had a lot of nice things to say about you. I'd like to offer you the position." I felt my heart leap into my throat. I almost let out a wild whoop of excitement, but I clamped my hand over my mouth and just stared at Edric with wide eyes. He was leaning on the doorframe with his arms folded across his chest. Even Selena and the maids were poking their heads curiously out of the kitchen. Thank you so much," I said, hardly able to contain my excitement. "I accept. I can't wait to start." As I spoke, I saw the maids begin to dance around excitedly in the background while Selena stared at me with disbelief. Edric, however, just smiled. It seemed as though he had been confident in me getting the job. "Good." The headmistress replied, "You can come by any time within the next week and sign your paperwork. Once that's done, you can have your keys. I have the custodians clear out anything that's been stored in your room." "Thank you," I said, unable to come up with anything else amidst my shock. I'll see you soon." Finally, I hung up and continued to stare at Edric in shock. "I knew you would get it," he said with a smile. I didn't know what to say. It felt as though my body was taken over with excitement, and what I did next almost felt out of my control. Without thinking, I ran over to Edric, cupped his face in my hands, and pulled him down to my level and kissed him. His lips were soft and sweet, and he didn't pull away. When I finally pulled away, my face was red and my eyes were wide. The room was silent, and I could see Selena quietly shoving the 2 curious maids back into the kitchen to give Edric and I some privacy. Sorry." I tried to stammer out an apology for kissing him so suddenly, but I was too embarrassed for anything coherent to come out. Part of me expected Edric to simply storm off, just as he always did when he realized that we had gotten too close. But he didn't. Instead, he just smiled down at me. His eyes were warm and bright, and he didn't seem embarrassed by the kiss at all. "I guess we'll have to go school supply shopping for 2 now," he said, causing me to smile. Between the good news, my kiss with Edric, and his kind words, that smile didn't leave my face until I finally drifted off to sleep that night. It felt as though things were really beginning to look up now, and I couldn't have been more excited. In fact, my worrisome conversation with Olivia had slipped my mind entirely by that point. Moana. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Edric walking around the room. When I looked at the clock, I realized that it was a little later than I usually would have gotten up, and I quickly sat up and rubbed my eyes. "Sorry," I said, throwing the covers off and getting out of bed. "I overslept. Guess I missed my alarm." Edric shook his head. I turned it off for you, he said as he fixed his hair in the ensuite bathroom mirror. I let you sleep in. I scrunched my eyebrows together. Why? Normally, I woke up a full half-hour earlier than this so that I could help prepare breakfast and get Ella ready, and sometimes I woke up even earlier than that. We're going out, he replied. School supply shopping, remember? My eyes widened for a moment. Edric had mentioned that we would have to do some school supply shopping, but I didn't think that he would want to do it so soon. Either way, I smiled and ran to my room to get ready for the day. I put on something comfortable to wear, knowing that we would likely be walking around a lot, and then got Ella ready as well at Edric's request. Ella was, of course, excited to go school shopping for the first time, and hardly sat down long enough to even eat her breakfast. I can't wait to be a regular girl, Ella suddenly said as we gathered our things and waited for the elevator to open. I'll be just like all of the other kids. At Ella's words, Edric and I both suddenly looked up at each other with incredulous looks on our faces. You are still a regular girl, love, I replied with a chuckle as I tugged her sun hat onto her head. I know, Ella said, but I'm still excited. I smiled and took her hand, then stepped onto the elevator with her and Edric. As the elevator carried us down, I chanced to look over at Edric. I could have sworn that I saw a bit of a tear in his eye, but he quickly blinked it away and just smiled at me instead. We headed to the mall where our first stop was at a children's store for Ella. Even though she would be wearing a uniform at school and there was no need for new clothes, she still picked out a backpack, accessories, and a little pair of Mary Jane shoes to wear with her uniform. I was excited to see how cute she would look in her uniform, and I couldn't wait. Afterwards, we went to the office supply store. I helped Ella pick out notebooks and folders off of the list of supplies that the headmistress gave us. Edric disappeared for a bit, then returned with a cart full of stuff. Whoa, Ella said, jumping up on the side of the cart to peer in. That's a lot of stuff. Edric simply shrugged. There's a sale, he said, jabbing his thumb over his shoulder in the direction of the art supply aisle. I peered into the cart as well to see that he had fully stocked up on dozens of containers of crayons, coloring books, miniature canvases, acrylic and watercolor paint sets, and more. This might be too much, Edric, I said with a laugh. She's just one kid. It's not just for her, he grinned. You'll need supplies for your classroom too, right? And I wanted to get something for the kids at the orphanage. My eyes widened at the alpha billionaire's sudden charity. He certainly didn't need to buy anything for the kids at the orphanage, but he decided to do it without even being asked. I couldn't help but smile. He had changed so much since I had met him. The Edric Morgan who I knew when I was almost hit by his car on the city street was gone now, and I didn't know where he went. It was almost as though he was replaced by this newer, kinder Edric Morgan. That's very kind of you, I said with a smile. But you don't need to buy my supplies for me. Let me buy them with my own salary. Edric was silent for a moment. I could tell that he was about to refuse, just as he always did, but this time I wouldn't let him. Ella had jumped off of the cart to go and look at a colorful notebook on the shelf, and now I grabbed the end of the cart and tugged it lightly toward myself. Seriously, Edric, I said with a bit of a laugh. Let me pay. Edric narrowed his eyes and tugged the cart back toward himself. No, I'm paying. Now I was the one who narrowed my eyes, and I pulled the cart even harder and with more determination than before. Edric Morgan, let me pay for these supplies. The smile on Edric's face turned to a frown, and maybe he was a little more determined than I was. He tightened his grip on the cart, then yanked it back toward himself. I won't let you, he began, but then his eyes widened and his voice faltered as I lost my balance from the cart being yanked away and suddenly fell backwards. I started to fall, my arms windmilling at my sides as I tried to balance myself, but it was too late. I nearly landed on my butt on the floor. But I didn't fall. Edric moved like a flash of lightning, faster than I had ever seen him move before. He raced around the cart and caught me. I let out a small gasp, more so at his speed than the fact that I was about to topple over 2 feet onto my bottom on the carpeted floor, and looked up at Edric with wide eyes as he held me. His eyes were glowing. He had used his werewolf abilities to catch me, even though I wouldn't have hurt myself at all. I stammered. Edric was looking down at me with intensity, his arms wrapped tightly around me. I thought I even saw his eyes flicker down to my lips, but I couldn't be entirely sure. All I knew was that, even though I would have been fine if I had fallen, and I had only lost my balance, he had gone out of his way to catch me. And now, for some strange reason, I felt Mina get excited inside of me and urge me to kiss him again. The taste of his lips from the night before still lingered on my tongue, and I felt my heart rate quicken as I imagined kissing him again. "Whoa, what happened?" Ella said, dropping the pile of colored pencils and shiny notebooks in her hands as she ran over to us. "Moana, did you faint?" I shook my head, snapped back to reality by Ella's voice. Edric stood me upright and let go of me. He quickly averted his gaze, but I thought I saw him blush a bit. "I'm fine," I said, smoothing down my skirt. I spotted the pile of discarded things on the floor and pointed to them. "Ella, don't make a mess. Pick those up." Moana. A few weeks passed after that. With each passing day, Ella became more and more excited for school, and I was just as excited. After singing my paperwork and getting the keys to my classroom, I then spent the next few weeks leading up to the start of the school year preparing my lesson plans, stocking up on supplies, and cleaning out the abandoned art classroom. On the morning of the first day of school, I woke up to Ella jumping on the bed and shouting, "Moana! Daddy!" She shrieked excitedly, jumping up and down and jostling both of us out of our sleep. "Wake up! It's the first day of school!" I cracked my eyes open to see Ella standing above us with a wide grin on her face. Beside me, Edric groaned slightly and finally sat up. All right, he said, rubbing his eyes and swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "Come on, let's all have breakfast together before your first day of school." The night prior, I had already helped Ella pack her backpack and laid out her uniform. I had also packed my own bag filled with the things that I would need for the day and set our bags out by the front door together. I had to admit that I felt a little nervous as I got dressed that morning, but I was also excited, and seeing Ella in her adorable little plaid uniform and Mary Jane's made me smile. After breakfast, it was time to go. Selena packed a lunch for both of us and even gave Ella a little squeeze and a smile before sending us on our way. Edric walked to school with us. Once again, Ella walked between us and held each of our hands, and I felt like we were a little family once more. I hoped that this would become a tradition of ours. As we arrived at the school, the front yard was bustling with the activity of the hordes of other little girls who were excited for their first day. The display ranged from preschool children who were crying and being carried in by their exhausted parents, all the way to bored high school students who just seemed happy to see their friends and to know that they would be graduating this year. Ella was clearly nervous and clung to Edric's leg tightly as we walked up to the parent drop-off point. "Daddy, I'm scared," Ella whined, looking up at Edric with big saucer eyes. "There are so many kids, and it's loud." Edric smiled and crouched down to her level. He tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and then held her firmly by both shoulders. "You're going to have a lot of fun," he said. "I promise, and Moana will be here all day if you need her, and I'll be waiting right here for you when the day is over. It'll go by before you know it, okay?" Ella hesitantly nodded, sniffling a bit. Edric planted a kiss on her cheek. Almost as soon as he did that, it seemed that another group of little girls had already taken interest in Ella and were slowly inching their way toward us, fiddling nervously with their backpack straps. What's your name?" One of the little girls, a scrawny little thing with wispy blonde hair, said sheepishly. "Ella," Ella replied, her face turning red. One of the other girls, a slightly bigger girl with brown hair and freckles, stepped out from behind the rest of the group and grinned widely. "I'm Stacy. Want to play with us before school starts?" Ella hesitated and looked up at Edric. He nodded, and as though she had known these girls for her entire life, Ella took off toward the playground with them. I couldn't help but laugh at how simple it was for children to make friends. I missed those days. By the end of the day, I was certain that she would be calling them all her best friends forever. Finally, Edric turned back to look at me and smiled. "You sure you'll be okay?" he asked. I nodded. I'll be fine. Just call me immediately if you start to feel sick or anything. I couldn't help but laugh a bit. Edric, it'll be okay, I said, giving his arm a squeeze. I'll see you later, okay? Edric nodded hesitantly. I gave him a little wave and turned to leave, but suddenly I felt his hand on my arm. He pulled me back, turning me to face him so that I could see the worried look in his eyes. And then he kissed my forehead, making my face turn beet red. Be careful, he whispered, taking a step back and releasing me. He shoved his hands in his pockets, and without another word, he walked away and left me standing there with a racing heart and butterflies in my stomach. Once the bell rang, all of the students lined up to go inside. Ella was still with her group of little friends, which made me feel a bit relieved, and I made my way up to my classroom as the teachers began to march their students through the hallways for homeroom. I noticed that quite a few kids of all ages were giving me strange looks, but I just waved and smiled and unlocked my classroom door. I still had some time before my first class would begin, so after I settled in a bit, I made my way over to the faculty lounge for some coffee. There were a couple of other teachers in there, the music teacher, whose name was Jeff, and one of the science teachers, Deborah. I had already bumped into them a couple of times over the summer, and so we exchanged brief pleasantries before I scurried back to my classroom to get ready for my first lesson. It didn't take long before the first class came in, and, much to Ella's surprise, although I already knew and was looking forward to seeing her smile throughout my first class, it was her third grade class. Good morning, everyone, I said as the students filed in with their teacher standing in the doorway. I'm Miss Fowler, but you can call me Moana. Sit anywhere you like. As the kids hurried around to pick their seats, I stood up at the front and waited patiently. I had set up the desks in a semicircle around the room to make the atmosphere more welcoming, and there was a carpet on the floor in the middle with cushions that I would let the students sit on if they wanted. Almost immediately, Ella and several other girls beelined for the cushions. The other girls got there first and almost shoved Ella out of the way in the process. Hey, Ella said, frowning. You pushed me. You should sit in the back, half-blood, one of the little girls snarled. She was a little girl who was taller than the rest, with ginger hair and blue eyes. Her face was pointed, like a little fox, and she had a bit of a nasty look to her. My eyes widened. I opened my mouth to say something with the intention of shutting that sort of nastiness down immediately, but before I could, Ella folded her arms and puffed her chest out. You know? Moana, you know? Ella frowned and folded her arms, puffing out her chest confidently before I could say anything. After those little girls nastily called her a half-blood and shoved her, I had expected Ella to come to me crying, and that I would have to send them to the headmistress's office, and all on my first day of teaching. But instead, Ella stood up straight and took on a confident air that I hadn't expected from her. Buzz off, one of the other little girls said, waving her hand dismissively. We don't bother with half-bloods. You smell. She pinched her nose, causing the other girls in her group to giggle. You're really mean, Ella replied. Why do you have to say things like that? Didn't your parents ever teach you to treat everyone equally and with respect? The little girls giggled nastily at Ella's comment. Even though Ella was confident, I was well aware of how school bullies functioned, and I knew that she wouldn't get through to them. I would have to speak to their teacher or even their parents, and that would be the only way to stop the bullying. Even then, many kids continued to be bullies regardless of the repercussions. It was sad that Ella had to realize this on her first day of school, but it was the truth. Ella, I said finally, stepping in, take your seat. I'll handle this. However, Ella just ignored me and kept reprimanding them with even more vigor. You should learn to treat everyone nicely, Ella growled. If you were half human too, or even a whole human, you wouldn't like it if anyone else said mean things to you. My daddy always says to treat everyone else how you want to be treated. The gaggle of nasty little girls went silent. I was shocked by Ella's impressive public speaking abilities. She seemed to have gotten it from her father. I thought to myself, The mean girl's apparent leader, the redhead with the pointed face, scowled deeply and seemed as though she couldn't come up with anything nasty to say as a retort. It also seemed as though the other children noticed the argument and had now gathered around and were beginning to cheer Ella on. "Rebecca, you're a meanie," one little girl said. I recognized her as the timid blonde girl from that morning. "Yeah," another girl, the one who introduced herself as Stacy earlier, said loudly. "You're always bullying everyone. You're just a big meanie because you're Mom." All right, I said, deciding to intervene before things got any worse and more insults got thrown around. "Let's all settle down." I then looked down at the mean girls, who were still sitting on the floor but whose faces were all beet red by now, and I frowned. "I won't send you to the headmistress this time, but I won't tolerate bullying in my class. If I see you three bullying anyone again, whether it's in class or outside of class, you'll be marching down to the headmistress's office right away. Understand?" The three nasty little girls nodded, clearly regretting their actions. I ordered them to sit at desks and revoked their privilege to sit on the cushions for that day and instead let Ella and her friends sit there. Ella grinned widely as she sat down. "Thanks, Mom," she said to me. My eyes widened. There was a chorus of gasps across the room. One of the kids who was sitting with Ella jumped up and exclaimed, "Ella, the new art teacher is your mom?" Ella nodded vigorously before I could say anything. Not that I would have been able to correct her anyway, considering the fact that Edric had told the news that I was her mother, but it was still strange to hear her refer to me as anything other than my first name. Not only that, but I quickly became worried that the other kids would like her less if they knew that I was her mom. Maybe they would see her as even more of an outsider and would accuse me of favoritism. "Yep," Ella said, grinning. "She's the best mom ever." Everyone was shocked. I felt a tear come to my eye as I saw Ella smiling up at me, but I quickly blinked it away. A hush fell over the room for a few moments before one of the other girls spoke up. "I wish my mom was a teacher," the little girl said, "but she works at an office. My dad says that she's a pencil pusher. I don't know what that means, though." I stifled a laugh and finally decided to cut the discussion short and begin my lesson after that. We spent the remainder of class playing fun games so the children could get comfortable with me, and then ended the class with a coloring session. I actually got along well with all of the kids, and even the nasty girls seemed to have settled down their bad behavior. Soon enough, the half hour of the class flew by, and the children's teacher came to take them back to their classroom. Ella and all of the other kids waved at me as they left, and I couldn't wipe the smile off of my face after that. That day, after Ella's little speech and the way that she exposed our relationship, I noticed that no one seemed to be bothering her. I ran into Ella a few more times that day during lunchtime and recess, and she didn't seem to be having any more trouble with anyone. In fact, it seemed as though Ella had even made quite a few more friends by the time we walked out of the school together that afternoon. Everyone must have wanted to be friends with the cool new girl who stood up to the bully and whose mom was the art teacher. As I took her little hand and led her out of the school, I couldn't stop smiling, although I couldn't tell if my smile was from Ella's success on her first day of school or if it was from her calling me Mom. Maybe it was both. Either way, as Ella skipped happily next to me and Edric's tall frame came into view in the golden light of the late afternoon sun, I felt happier than ever. Edric was waiting for us at the parent drop-off point as we approached, and when Ella saw him, she let go of my hand and raced up to him. He scooped her up and kissed her cheek, but as I got closer, I saw that he looked a little worried. "Well," he asked, "how was your first day?" "It was amazing," Ella exclaimed. "I made lots of friends, and I learned all about syllables?" Edric asked. Ella nodded excitedly. "Yeah, those. And there were these mean girls, but I stood up to them." As we began to walk home, Ella continued to chatter nonstop about her exciting first day of school. She told Edric all about how she stood up to the nasty girls in art class, and how she made more friends at recess, and how she couldn't wait for her second day of school. Slowly, as she talked, Edric's look of worry turned into a warm smile, and as he carried her on his shoulders, I felt his hand reach out and slip into mine. Moana. A few more days passed by after that. By the end of our first week of school, it seemed as though Ella and I both had settled in quite well. Ella was making loads of friends and loved her teachers, and I also enjoyed teaching. It finally felt as though I was living my childhood dream of being an art teacher, although I did find it difficult to connect with the other teachers. They weren't unkind and did exchange pleasantries with me each day, but I could tell that they didn't want to associate with me too much since they still thought that I was human. Maybe over time they would get to know me a bit more and would get over some of their biases. However, right now I couldn't help but wish that my wolf would just emerge already so that I would stop having to deal with this sort of attitude from people. Unfortunately, however, it didn't seem like Mina was getting a whole lot stronger. She seemed to be stagnating a bit at her current level of strength. "It's probably the baby," she said when I asked her about it one morning. "I think when you have the baby, I'll be able to get stronger. For now, your body is focusing on keeping you both healthy for the pregnancy." It made sense, but it didn't necessarily make me feel any better about the situation. For now, because no one really wanted to talk to me too much, I spent the majority of my lunch breaks eating and drawing in my classroom. Normally it was fine and I quite enjoyed the downtime, but on this particular Friday I quickly came to the realization that I should have gone to the faculty lounge when I heard a knock on my door. I looked up, my cheeks stuffed with my sandwich, and quickly covered my mouth with my hand when I saw the headmistress standing there. "Oh, sorry to interrupt," she said, "but you have a visitor." I finished chewing and swallowed, then waved her in. "Thank you, Headmistress Hawkins," I said with a smile. I half expected it to be Edric stopping by, or maybe Selena. But my smile faded when I saw who it really was, Ethan. "Hi, Moana," he said with a bit of a sheepish smile. He was holding a vase of flowers in his hand as he walked into my room. Part of me wanted to yell at him to get out after the way that he kissed me. I had thought about it a lot, and I was almost entirely certain that he and Kelly had worked together that night to make Edric kick me out. I remembered the evil look in his eye when I saw Edric confronting him, and how his demeanor suddenly shifted theatrically when he noticed me standing there. It wasn't just that, but seeing him so suddenly instantly reminded me of my conversation at the orphanage with Olivia, who I was still unsure about. If it was possible that she really was an actress after all, then Ethan would have been on my list of suspects as to who hired her to begin with. But I didn't yell at him or kick him out. Maybe I was too nice, or maybe I was afraid. If he worked with Kelly before, then did he work with her when she hired those rogues to attack me? "Hey, Ethan," I said, standing from my desk so abruptly I almost knocked my chair over. My voice faded away. What was I supposed to say to him? To what do I owe the pleasure? "Nice to see you. What the hell are you doing in my classroom?" Long time no see. I almost instantly cringed at my choice of words, but Ethan didn't seem to notice. Instead, he simply held up the flowers a bit. "I brought you a peace offering," he said, his cheeks turning a little red with embarrassment. "I know I hurt your feelings that night at the party. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I've realized that I overstepped a lot of boundaries, and that wasn't right. But I'd like to make it up to you, if you'll let me." I still didn't entirely trust him, but I was willing to hear him out. Maybe he would confess to working with Kelly. He did seem as though he was trying to make amends. With a stiff smile, I walked around my desk and took the flowers from him. They came in an expensive-looking crystal vase, and the flowers were a lovely array of sunflowers, baby's breath, and chamomile. I set the vase down on my desk, feeling Ethan's eyes on me the entire time, and turned back to offer him another stiff smile. "Thank you," I said. Ethan smiled back at me. There was a bit of an awkward silence as we stared at each other like two cautious felines before he broke the silence by looking around at the classroom. "So, you're an art teacher now, huh?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah, Ella is coming to school here now, and the position was open, so I just went for it." Ethan looked at me and raised an eyebrow. "You convinced Edric to send Ella to school? How on earth did you do that?" I shrugged. "He pretty much came to the conclusion himself," I said. "I just recommended it." Ethan nodded slowly, then shoved his hands in his pockets and stared down at the floor. "Well, I'm happy for both of you," he finally said, lifting his gaze a bit to meet mine. I had forgotten how charmingly shy he always was. It didn't make up for what he did and what I saw in him on the night of the party, but he wasn't acting suspicious now. Was this all an act, too? Or was he genuinely sorry for everything that happened and wanted to be friends again? Honestly, I was a bit lonely since the other teachers didn't really want to associate with me, but at the same time, I knew that being friends with Ethan, regardless of how sincere he was being, wouldn't bode well for my relationship with Edric. Things were going so smoothly between Edric and I now that I didn't want to throw a wrench into it by secretly becoming friends with his half-brother again behind his back. Anyway, Ethan paused, chewing the inside of his cheek, and leaned back on one of the desks behind him. "I saw on the news that you two are officially engaged." I nodded. I didn't know if I should have told him whether it was fake or not. Although if Michael, Verona, and Kelly all knew, then he surely knew as well. Either way, I wanted to be vague, so I didn't say anything. Ethan looked at me for a moment, then quickly looked away. His cheeks turned a little red again as he spoke. "If you don't mind me asking," he said, clearing his throat and meeting my gaze once more, "what made Edric suddenly decide to have a public relationship and announce you as Ella's biological mother?" Moana. "If you don't mind me asking, what made Edric suddenly decide to have a public relationship and announce you as Ella's biological mother?" My eyes widened at Ethan's sudden question. It was rather unexpected, and despite the gentle and curious tone of voice he used and the innocent redness in his soft cheeks, I found his question downright creepy. After everything that had happened with Ethan, both leading up to and during the last party when he kissed me without my consent, I didn't think for a moment that any sort of question like that wasn't loaded in some way or another. The fact alone that he suddenly showed up at my place of work, and I didn't even fully know how he knew that I worked here yet, was enough of a cause for concern. I am pregnant with his child." I responded with a bit of a nervous laugh and gestured at my belly, which had grown a bit since I last saw Ethan and now couldn't be hidden terribly well under my dress. It was the most logical thing to do, I guess. Ethan nodded slowly, but didn't answer right away. He then pushed himself up off of the desk he was leaning on and walked over to a corkboard that I had on the wall, which displayed some of my students' artwork. He studied it carefully and seemed to be thinking. I noticed that his eyes landed on something that Ella drew, and I knew that he knew that it was her drawing because her name was on it in big, crooked letters. He continued staring at it for a few moments, which made me oddly uncomfortable, before he turned back to face me and smiled. "Well, I'm glad that you two figured something out that works for you," he said. He paused, licking his lips. "It's just, I don't know. Edric was always part of the whole anti-human crowd. So much has changed about him recently. I mean, I was already surprised enough when he wanted you to live with him and keep the baby, but to announce a public relationship with a human, and to claim that you're Ella's biological mother. What's your point, Ethan?" I asked, feeling myself getting more agitated. Part of me wanted to snap at him and tell him that I wasn't even a human, but I didn't feel comfortable disclosing that information to him. Ethan shrugged. "Nothing, really." "Well, that's a lie, actually." He let out a wry chuckle. I folded my arms across my chest, trying to make him aware that I was losing patience without outright telling him off, but he didn't seem to notice. "I'm only curious because I thought that there was something special about you, Moana. I could sense it on you. Maybe Edric already knows, or maybe he doesn't realize it. Maybe you yourself don't even realize it. But I just want to say that if you happen to need any help figuring out your lineage or anything like that, I'd be happy to help you out with it." I tried to hide my shock. Was Ethan being truthful, or was he just pulling my leg? Either way, it felt as though he was fishing for information, and it filled me with discomfort. "Thanks, but I'm fine," I replied. "And I'm not sure if you know this, but Kelly did hire rogues to attack me. Edric had to save me. So if you're wondering why we suddenly decided to have a public relationship, then maybe it was because that whole terrible ordeal traumatized both of us so much that it actually brought us closer and made us realize our feelings for each other. And you can tell Kelly that too." Ethan's eyes went wide for a moment. I couldn't tell if he already knew about the ordeal in the Rogue District or if that whole experience had been kept a secret, but either way, I didn't care. At this point, I just wanted him out of my classroom. My lunch break was almost over, and I would have a high school class coming in soon that I needed to prepare for. Therefore, when Ethan opened his mouth to speak, I cut him off. "Thank you for the flowers, but I do need to get back to work," I said, trying to sound at least somewhat polite without giving the impression that I was even remotely interested in speaking again. Ethan seemed to get the picture. He nodded slowly and, without a word, turned on his heel and walked out of the room. Once he was gone, I sank back down into my chair with a sigh and passed my hand over my face. Even just that ordeal was enough to exhaust me, and now that it was over, I felt deflated. I placed my hand over my belly and rubbed it gently, soothing both myself and the little werewolf that was inside of me. "Mina," I thought, leaning my head back on my chair and staring up at the ceiling. "I know it's hard, but I need you to try to get stronger. I'm tired of having to hide my true nature, and I'm tired of feeling helpless when Edric isn't around." My wolf didn't respond, but I knew that she heard me. Whether or not she would be able to heed my words was still up for debate. I knew that there was no way to rush her getting stronger and emerging, and I really only said it to make myself feel better. For the remainder of that day, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan's strange visit. His flowers sat on my desk, taunting me in their stupid crystal vase, as I wondered if I should tell Edric that Ethan came and asked me all of those questions, or if I should just keep it a secret and pretend it never happened. If he found out eventually, would he be mad at me, or would he understand? It wasn't just that, either. The way that Ethan pried for answers, the way that he stared at Ella's drawing with such a strange intensity, the way that he somehow knew where I worked when it shouldn't have been common knowledge yet. All of it felt strange. A visit that, to Ethan, was apparently supposed to be a chance to reconcile, wound up unsettling me more than anything. Was he watching me? Was he working with Kelly and Michael? Did I need to be worried about myself, the baby, or even Ella? There was no way of knowing just what Ethan was up to, if anything, and I had been through enough stress already. That was why, by the end of the day, I decided that it was best to just move on and pretend that it never happened. It was better for everyone if it was swept under the rug, and when I saw Edric smile as I walked to meet him with Ella, I knew that I had made the right decision. After all, I didn't want the news of his half-brother's strange and uncalled-for visit to make that smile fade from his face. Moana. I went home after work that day with an odd feeling in my stomach after my conversation with Ethan. All of it felt so contrived. At first I thought that he was just trying to make amends for what happened at the family party. But when the strange questions began, it became obvious to me that he was either fishing for information or he was trying to drive another wedge between Edric and I. Maybe it was both of those things, or maybe it was neither. Either way, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should tell Edric about it or if I should just pretend it didn't happen. Part of me felt as though the right thing to do would be to tell Edric that Ethan had suddenly shown up in my classroom. But at the same time, I was worried that he would tell me that I shouldn't be teaching there anymore. Even though it had only been a week since I had begun my new job, I loved every moment of it, and it felt as though my dreams were finally becoming a reality. I couldn't let anyone get in the way of that. And so that evening, I decided not to tell Edric after all. I just told myself that Ethan wouldn't come back again after that, and that I didn't need to worry. Everything would settle down soon. That evening, I helped Ella with her homework before dinner. She seemed to be doing well in school and was enjoying her new learning environment. Thanks to her excellent tutors, she wasn't behind in her education at all. However, she still seemed to be adjusting to being in a learning environment with other children. I expected that, of course, and so I wasn't surprised when she came to me with gripes about other students. "Lucy always takes too long to answer the teacher's questions, and the teacher reprimanded me when I said the answer today," Ella growled, sounding annoyed. I frowned. "She reprimanded you?" I asked. How come? Ella shrugged. She says that everyone needs to raise their hand if they want to answer a question, but I don't see why. I knew the answer, and Lucy was taking forever, so I just said it. I had to stifle a bit of a laugh. Ella, you have to give other kids a chance to answer, I said gently. Maybe some kids need to take a little longer to think before they can answer, and that's okay. Ella furrowed her brow. But it was an easy question. Is there something wrong with Lucy? I shook my head. No. Love, I replied. Just because someone takes a little longer doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with them. And besides, there's nothing really wrong with anyone. Everyone is just different. Oh. Ella scrunched up her nose, just like she always did when she was a little annoyed. I ruffled her hair and sent her off to her room after that to get ready for dinner. Edric didn't come home until after dinner that evening. In fact, I was a bit surprised to hear him come home so late. I was sitting up in bed in Edric's room, sketching in my sketchbook while I waited for him. The sun had just gone down and the city lights had come on. I sort of missed the mountain estate when it was actually dark out after the sun went down. Even though I loved the city, it was never really dark here. I wanted to see the stars. I didn't realize that Edric came home, actually. I assumed that he would be out even later. With everything going on recently, I supposed that he would be working later in the day for a little while. I just hoped that he would be home before I fell asleep. I liked having him beside me when I laid down to go to bed. However, just as I was giving up hope and was coming to the conclusion that I would need to go to sleep without him, the sound of soft piano music suddenly came to my ears. I perked up in bed, my eyes widening as I looked around and realized that the piano music was coming from the living room. Edric had played the piano only once since I had moved in. I only got a chance to listen from afar for a few minutes before he noticed my presence and he stopped playing, and I hadn't heard him play since then. But as I slowly got up and creeped out of the room, I was determined to listen to him play for a little longer tonight. I wasn't sure why the alpha billionaire chose to play the piano tonight. Lately, he had seemed happier than usual. Maybe that was it. I quietly closed the bedroom door behind me and made my way toward the dark living room. As I did, the piano music became louder. It was even more beautiful now and made me smile. When I walked out into the living room, I saw Edric sitting at the piano. He had tossed his suit jacket down over the back of the couch and had rolled up his sleeves and was hunched over the piano as the cool blue moonlight streamed in through the open window. I didn't know the name of what he was playing, but it was ethereal. The way that his fingers gently brushed each key made it look almost as though he was lightly petting the piano and not actually playing it. He looked so peaceful during that moment. Maybe I got a little too close, though, because Edric suddenly stopped and looked up at me. Even in the darkness, I could see that his face went red. "Sorry," he stuttered. "Did I wake you up?" I shook my head and smiled. "No," I replied. "I like hearing you play. Please don't stop." Edric looked at me for a few moments before taking in a sharp breath and starting to play again. Only this time, he started making mistakes. There was an odd chord here, an out-of-tune note there, and at one point he hit more than one key at once. I could tell that he was getting frustrated. He suddenly stopped again and let out a sigh. But I had an idea. I could tell that he was nervous with an audience, but I still wanted to listen. So, with a smile, I walked over to the window and looked out with my back turned to him. "I won't look if that helps," I said gently. "But I really do like to hear you play. I'll just listen if you don't mind." Edric didn't say anything for a bit. I heard him shifting uncomfortably on the piano bench, and I felt a pang in my chest as I wondered if I should have just left him alone and listened from his bedroom. But then a smile spread across my face as I heard the first notes being played again. Now that I was only listening, he didn't mess up any of the notes. In fact, he only played even more beautifully. The melody was almost haunting, but only in the best way. And the entire time he played for me, even though I couldn't see him, the smile never left my face. During those moments, I was happier than I had ever felt before. Moana. As I listened to Edric playing the piano, I couldn't wipe the smile off of my face. I wished that I could see him, but if it made him too nervous, then I was happy to just listen. He played beautifully, and I hoped that I could always hear his music from then on. The song that he was playing came to an end and was followed by silence. I didn't realize it, but I had shut my eyes as I lost myself listening to the music. I opened them again and turned, expecting him to still be sitting at the piano, but he wasn't. He was standing right behind me, looking down at me with those glowing silver eyes. Edric was so close to me that I could smell his cologne coming off of his shirt and could feel his warm breath on my face. Being this close to him made me tremble, but only in a good way. "Edric," I whispered, looking up to meet his gaze. He stared down at me silently, with only his glowing silver eyes conveying his emotion. There was something harsh and dominant about them, but something soft, too. Suddenly, Edric bent down to kiss me. His kiss was deep and passionate, and his tongue began to work its way in between my parted lips as our breaths intertwined. I felt his arm wrap firmly around my waist, and he pulled me close. It was almost a little too rough, but at the same time it sent an excited shiver down my spine. My entire body bristled with titillation. Finally, after seemingly becoming closer to me after the most recent weeks, I could be intimate with Edric again. Everything felt as though it was falling into place, and I couldn't have been happier. As he kissed me deeply and sensually, Edric's hands slid up my back, through my hair and around the nape of my neck. He tilted my chin up further with his hands as he cupped my face, and he was about to. But then he just stopped. The silver light in his eyes faded back to gray, and he quickly covered my breast again before sitting up and putting distance between us. His face looked red with embarrassment, and he avoided my gaze. I sat up abruptly, my eyebrows knit together with worry. "What's wrong?" I asked, feeling a pang in my chest as I looked at him. Edric shook his head and stood. "You have to stop releasing your scent," he said, his voice low and stern. "It's not fair. It makes me lose control." My eyes widened. I didn't know that Mina had released her scent yet again, and I would have to reprimand her for it later, as we had agreed that she would ask for permission first. But at the same time, I didn't fully understand why we had to keep doing this. "What does it matter?" I asked, standing and letting my thin nightgown fall back down around my legs. "We want each other. Why can't we just be intimate for once?" "I just can't," Edric replied, sounding almost annoyed. "It's not right." I furrowed my brow. "I'm carrying your baby," I said. My voice was beginning to raise slightly. "We've announced ourselves publicly as a couple. We sleep in the same bed, for goodness sake. Why do we need to keep doing this? What makes it not right?" Edric's face darkened. Instead of answering, he turned and walked over to the door to leave, but I ran after him. I wasn't going to let him just storm off, just like he always did when we got too close, and he felt the need to distance himself from me for no apparent reason. I grabbed his arm, maybe a little harder than I meant to, causing him to freeze and stare down at me with wide eyes. "Just talk to me, Edric," I said. "This has gone on for too long. I want to know the real reason behind why you find it so abhorrent to be intimate with me." "Because," Edric said, almost shouting now. He whirled around to face me fully, and his face was twisted with an expression that I couldn't read. "I will never marry you, not you and not anyone, and I don't want to give you the wrong idea. I don't care that you're my mate. The mate bond means nothing." My jaw dropped at Edric's words. I clapped my hand over my mouth and shook my head, my eyes widening as I took a step backwards. He knew all along that he was my mate? So my wolf's intuition was true after all? Edric's eyes were just as wide as mine as we stared at each other in complete silence. I could tell that he didn't mean to reveal it, but there was no taking it back now. I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know where to begin. The fact alone that Edric knew that I was his mate all along and never said anything hurt enough. But now to know that he still planned on not being with me, despite knowing that I was supposed to be his mate, just made me sick to my stomach. I couldn't be here anymore. Tonight, I would sleep in my own room, away from him. I needed space to think. Without another word, I quickly brushed past Edric. As I ran across the penthouse to my room, Edric didn't seem to be following me either. Once the door was locked behind me, I threw myself down on my bed that night and stared listlessly up at the moonlight-speckled ceiling. Never before had I heard of a mate refusing the mate bond, and now it was happening to me. Why did it seem as though I was cursed when it came to love? Edric, I want to know the real reason behind why you find it so abhorrent to be intimate with me, Moana said, chasing after me and grabbing my arm as I tried to storm out. What I said next was a mistake. I knew that as soon as the cruel words came out of my mouth, and I wished that I could take them back when I saw the look on Moana's soft face. Because, I said, whirling around to face Moana, I will never marry you. Not you, and not anyone, and I don't want to give you the wrong idea. I don't care that you're my mate. The mate bond means nothing. Moana's eyes widened. She released her grip on my arm and covered her mouth with her hand, taking a step back. We stared at each other in shocked silence for several long moments before she suddenly brushed past me and ran out of the room. God damn it, Edric, I whispered to myself once she was gone. I slapped my hand on the wall and cursed under my breath. I felt like such a fool for saying too much. Not only had I revealed that Moana was my mate too early, but I'd completely misconstrued what I wanted to say, and I had hurt her feelings because of it. You're too harsh with her, Eddie, my wolf, said. He was normally silent and only offered advice when I specifically asked for it. Every wolf had its own personality, and Eddie was definitely the stoic type, but even he realized that I messed up just now and had to tell me about it. I'm aware of that, Eddie, I responded out loud as I paced restlessly around my bedroom. I sighed and flung the balcony doors open to let in the fresh air and stepped out into the cool night. As I leaned on the railing and looked out over the city, I felt myself beginning to be able to think more clearly. Truthfully, I did want to mate with Moana. I knew how I felt about her. I knew that, eventually, I would no longer be able to resist her no matter how hard I tried. But at the same time, I was terrified. I had spent my entire life hating the entire idea of the mate bond. I hated everything it stood for. I hated the lies that it spread, how people were so blinded by the idea of it that they just assumed that nothing could ever break the mate bond. My father and my mother were both living proof of the fact that the mate bond was complete and utter bullshit. They were supposed to be fated mates, and he still cheated on her. He still treated her poorly, and yet she continued to love him unconditionally. It made me sick. But deep down, I knew that Moana would never betray me. I knew that I could never betray her, either. I knew that I couldn't bring myself to hurt her, which was why I had been coming around to the idea. It wasn't that simple, though. If she marked me now, then she would shift too early. I had done my research over the past few weeks and discovered that late bloomers, like Moana, rare cases where people's wolves wouldn't appear until later in life, would often shift upon marking their mate. It was rare, but it could happen. Not only that, but it could be dangerous for both her and the baby, and I especially didn't need to worry about her being hunted. I was only trying to keep her safe. And yet, I still hurt her because I couldn't keep control of my stupid tongue. Why was I cursed with always saying the wrong things at the wrong times? Finally, with a sigh, I pushed myself away from the balcony railing and headed back inside. The bed looked empty without Moana. I needed to make things right with her. I decided to go over to her room and apologize and explain what I really meant earlier. At the very least, I thought that I should check on her. However, when I walked over to her bedroom and tried to open the door, I couldn't bring myself to do it. My hand froze just before I touched the doorknob. I heard what sounded like a sniffle inside, followed by a quiet sob. Had I made her cry? I stood frozen there for a few moments, battling with myself about whether I should go in there and talk to her or leave her alone. Go, Eddie urged me. Don't just ignore her. But I couldn't. She was crying because of me. I didn't want to show my face and make it even worse. Ultimately, I would only hurt her feelings again. And finally, despite my wolf's wishes, I chose to leave her alone. Eddie wasn't happy about that decision. Neither was I, admittedly. But I couldn't bring myself to look her in the face, not after I had made her cry with my words. I would have never admitted it to anyone, not even to myself, but I was embarrassed by my own actions. I decided that I would talk to her in the morning, after we had both had a good night of sleep. Everything was always better in the morning. But I couldn't sleep without her. I quickly realized that when I laid down, after almost an hour of tossing and turning, I finally cursed to myself and threw the blankets off. I got out of bed and walked over to the bathroom to retrieve my sleeping pills from the medicine cabinet. Just one, I said to myself under my breath with a sigh before popping the pill in my mouth and swallowing it without even any water. I frowned as I looked at myself in the mirror. I had been doing so well without the sleeping pills, and I hated the way that they made me feel. I hadn't even really been drinking lately, and I probably had Moana to thank for that. Moana and her strange abilities. Now I had pushed her away and had to resort to the old methods of getting sleep. I went back to bed, but another hour passed and sleep still didn't come. I popped another couple of pills. Within half an hour after that, I was beginning to feel fuzzy. But I still couldn't sleep. I got out of bed and stumbled back to the medicine cabinet, dumping 2 more pills out into my hand. How many had I taken at this point? I furrowed my brow as I counted in my head, but I quickly lost count, and I lost my sense of logic along with it. I popped 2 more pills. What happened that night after that was a blur. I wasn't sure how many times I got up and stumbled over to the medicine cabinet, but soon it got to the point where I lost count entirely, and forgot that I had even gotten up before. Each time I got up, I felt like a broken record, and each time I popped a pill, I felt as though I hadn't taken any medicine yet. I didn't know what happened exactly after the 5th or 6th time that I stumbled over to the medicine cabinet. Reality was fading in and out in flashes, and then, before I even made it back to the bed, everything went completely dark, and all I felt was the sensation of my knees buckling under me, and my head hitting the floor. Moana. That night, I tried to fight the tears, but no matter how hard I fought and tried to keep my head up, I couldn't entirely stop myself from crying just a little bit. After all, I had just discovered that Edric not only knew all along that I was his mate, but that he also still didn't plan on ever being with me despite this. The thought of it made me feel incredibly sick, and I felt helpless. All I ever wanted was to give my baby the happy home life with 2 loving parents that I never got to have, and yet I had somehow managed to be the fated mate of someone who simply couldn't even bear the thought of being with me. Was there something wrong with me? Was that why I had such bad luck in love? My wolf, however, was surprisingly quiet throughout all of this, even though she supposedly released her scent, and that was what made Edric lose control and kiss me passionately. I didn't feel much from her. In fact, when I reached out and tried to talk to her for some guidance, she seemed different than usual. "Mina," I called out in my mind. Even though it had only been a short few months since I had discovered that I even had a wolf, talking to her telepathically was becoming more and more natural. I rarely ever accidentally spoke out loud, and it felt much less awkward now to talk to her in my mind. In fact, on occasion I even felt as though I could picture her whenever we talked. "Yes?" she responded. Her voice sounded like a distant echo. There was a sleepy, almost giddy quality to it. It almost sounded as though she had too much to drink, although that was just a silly thought. "Are you all right?" I asked. "Were you sleeping?" Even though it didn't make sense that she could have been sleeping with everything going on, I suppose that I still didn't quite know everything about how werewolves worked. Mina took a long time to respond. When she did, her voice sounded a little closer, but it still had that sleepy quality to it. "I'm okay. I've just been a little tired." I furrowed my brow and rolled onto my back, wiping the leftover tears off of my face with the back of my hand as I stared up at the ceiling. It was a bit worrying to hear my wolf sounding like this, and I had noticed that she seemed to be acting a bit off lately. But I decided that it was likely just from the pregnancy or maybe the stress of the incident with the rogues. Either way, I thought for sure that it couldn't be anything serious. I decided to let her rest that night, besides I was getting tired as well. Even though I wanted Edric by my side, I was still angry with him, and so I decided to finally crawl under my covers and try to sleep. Somehow, I did manage to sleep that night. There was a bit of tossing and turning, but it did finally happen. And when I woke up, I felt a little bit better about what had happened the night before. Maybe it was from a good night of sleep, Or maybe it was from the sun shining in through my open window. Maybe it was both. Either way, as I got out of bed, I decided that I was going to go over to Edric's room to talk to him. It was Saturday, so Ella would have training later, but there was still time. Maybe I could even convince Edric to go to the orphanage with me, and seeing the children would make both of us feel better. I threw on my robe and pulled my hair into a bun before heading over to Edric's room. When I arrived, I almost hesitated for a moment before biting my lip and knocking anyway. There was no response. I wanted to see if he was even home, so I quietly cracked open the door and peered in. I furrowed my brow, however, when I saw that the bedsheets were unkempt, but the bed was empty, as though he had gotten out of bed and left without making the bed. He always made his side of the bed as soon as he woke up, so it was out of character. Was he really so upset last night that he couldn't even follow his own routine in the morning? "Edric?" I called out quietly. I noticed that the bathroom door was open and the light was on, which was only more confusing, so I slowly stepped into the room. And when I did, my jaw dropped. "Edric!" I shouted, running over to where he was lying on the floor. He was lying face down on the floor with his arms outstretched, as though he had fallen in the middle of the night. I struggled to roll him over, but I finally managed to get him onto his back. His lips were a slight shade of blue. "How did this happen?" I whispered. But then I saw it, the empty bottle of pills laying on the bathroom floor. I couldn't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. Had Edric really tried to kill himself last night? My eyes filled with tears, and I began to shake him roughly. "Wake up!" I shouted. "Wake up! Selena, help!" A few moments later, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching. The door swung open, and Selena came into the room. She clapped her hand over her mouth and let out a sharp yell of surprise at the scene in front of her. "What happened?" she said, her voice shaking. I couldn't speak. I could only point at the empty bottle of pills as my hand shook violently, and I continued to shake Edric in an attempt to take him up to no avail. "I'll call the doctor," Selena said before running away. I continued to shake Edric. My tears dripped down my cheek and onto his shirt. "Please, Edric, wake up," I whimpered as I continued to shake him. "Please." I bent down over him as a choked sob came out of my mouth and put my ear to his chest. His heart was beating, at least. When I placed my finger under his nose, I could feel his breath coming out. A wave of relief washed over me as I realized that he was still alive at the very least, but I didn't know for how long. "Please be okay," I whispered. I took his hand and rubbed it gently, watching his face for any sign of movement while I heard Selena frantically calling the doctor in the other room. By now, I could hear the maids causing a commotion. Ella's tiny voice was mixed in, but I heard one of the maids make up a lie and take her away before she saw anything. "I called the doctor," Selena said as she burst back into the room. "He'll be here in 10 minutes. I nodded, but I felt too numb now to respond. All I could do was keep holding Edric's hand and keep watching his face. Edric, oh good, he's waking up. The first thing I noticed when I came back to consciousness was a splitting headache pounding in my skull. When I finally cracked open my eyes, squinting against even the dim light of my bedside table, I saw 3 figures bent over me, and judging from the hardness under my back and the position I was lying in, I quickly realized that I was laid out on the floor rather than my bed. What happened?" I muttered, noticing the distinct feeling of nausea rolling around in my stomach, as though I had had too many drinks the night before and was now hungover. "Shh! You're all right?" a male voice said. My eyes slowly came into focus, and the blurriness in my vision faded enough for me to see that my doctor was standing over me with a concerned look on his face and his stethoscope in his ears. Behind him, I could see Selena standing there with her arms folded across her chest and disappointment in her eyes. On my other side, Moana was staring intently at me and was holding my hand so tightly that it seemed as though her life depended on it. "Well, you're lucky you're a werewolf," the doctor said with an exasperated sigh as he finished listening to my heartbeat and put his stethoscope back around his neck. "That many pills could have killed a human, but you won't have any lasting damage." I furrowed my brow, feeling a bit confused. Last I remembered, I went to bed the night before after taking some sleeping pills. but oddly, everything felt much fuzzier than normal. I had never felt this way from taking my sleeping medicine before, unless... Did I take too much? I asked, blinking rapidly to refocus my eyes. Selena scoffed. Too much, she reprimanded. You took the entire bottle. What on earth possessed you to do something so horrible? If it weren't for Moana finding you this morning, you would have left 2 children without a father. Now, the doctor intervened, noticing the baffled expression on my face. Let's not jump to conclusions. Edric, do you remember how many pills you took last night? I shook my head. It was starting to come back to me, but it was still fuzzy. I think I might have gotten up a few more times than I meant to, I said. Right. I don't remember, though. The doctor let out another sigh and nodded slowly. So it wasn't intentional? He asked. I shook my head again, and everyone in the room let out a sigh of relief. The doctor pursed his lips thoughtfully before answering. It's not uncommon. If you take too many at first, you can forget how much you took before. It can be quite dangerous, and it does lead to accidental overdoses. Like I said, you're lucky that you're a werewolf and not a human. I'm guessing that your wolf had to put you into a bit of a dormant state in order to stop the poison from getting through your bloodstream. It's true, my wolf said in my mind. I kept trying to stop you, but the pills made it so you couldn't hear me. So that was what happened. I was relieved and thankful that my wolf was there to stop it. Thank you, doctor, I said, sitting up with ease. I promise it won't happen again. The doctor looked at me for a moment, then laughed and shook his head. Of course it won't happen again. I'm discontinuing your prescription. My eyes widened. Your what? I asked, feeling anger already beginning to bubble up inside of me. I need my medicine. You don't understand. Edric, I've already given him your stockpile of pills, Selena interrupted. When I looked over at her, she was frowning deeply at me. She looked both exhausted and angry. You're not taking them anymore. I passed my hand over my face and shook my head incredulously. This couldn't be happening. I needed my medication. I paid the doctor out of my own pocket, and he couldn't take my medication away. I'm not a child, I said angrily. You can't just confiscate my own medication that I paid for. Suddenly, Moana, who had been silent this entire time, spoke. Edric. Her voice was weak and shook a little bit. When I looked over at her, she was looking up at me with tears in her eyes. I realized then, from the look on her face and the way that she was gripping my hand, that she must have been so terrified when she found me lying on the floor that morning, and it made me feel like a major jerk for allowing that to happen. Please listen to the doctor. That medication is dangerous. I stared silently at Moana's soft face for a few moments. She looked haggard and terrified, and the longer I looked at her, the more I became angry with myself for letting her see me like that. Maybe she was right. If that medication was dangerous, maybe I shouldn't take it. I didn't want to scare her like that ever again. Finally, I let out an exasperated sigh and turned back to face the doctor. Fine, I murmured. I won't take the medication anymore. But, doctor, I need something for my sleeping problems. Isn't there anything you can do? The doctor simply shrugged. I'm afraid not, he said gently. I'm sorry, Edric. I wish I could do something for you, but I think that you're just going to have to find alternative methods for sleep. There are all sorts of homeopathic herbs and teas. You could try yoga or meditation before bed. I'll give you some recommendations if you'd like. I shook my head. That won't be necessary, I replied, feeling myself go a bit numb at the prospect of being without my medication. Suddenly, I felt Moana's hand tighten even more around mine. When I looked over at her, I felt myself soften once more at the sight of her. She seemed to give me a knowing look, as though she knew that her presence was the only thing other than medication that could make me sleep. And she was right. Thanks to her, I knew that I wouldn't need medication or any other homeopathic methods to sleep. But as my memories of the previous night flooded back into my brain, I remembered the awful things that I had said to her. I had told her that I would never marry her or anyone, and I had revealed that I knew that she was my mate, and yet I still didn't plan on marrying her, despite the baby in her belly. It wasn't really what I meant, but I had still said it because I was frustrated and angry that I had lost control around her, and because I was scared of committing when the thought of a mate bond made me sick. All of this happened because of me. because I took her for granted and pushed her away. I was a real jerk for that, and I didn't know how I could ever make it up to her. Moana was my only true sleeping pill, and I had hurt her badly with my horrible words. I only hoped that she could forgive me. Moana. The relief I felt when the doctor said that Edric would be okay couldn't even possibly be put into words. "Well, I think you'll be okay now," the doctor said as Edric got up to his feet with no trouble. "Rest today, and you'll be fine by tomorrow." Edric nodded. Both of us watched as Selena and the doctor walked out of the room, leaving Edric and I alone once more. Instantly, I turned toward him with a frown. "Don't scare me like that," I said in a scolding, yet quiet voice. Before Edric could answer, I ushered him over to the bed and forced him to lie down, just as the doctor ordered. "Geez," Edric said, lying down. "I get it. You don't need to worry about me now, though." I shook my head and frowned even more. There was so much I wanted to say. I wanted to tell him that he was a bloody fool for pushing me away. I wanted to ask him if he realized now that he needed me after all, and that it wasn't smart of him to take my presence for granted. But as I looked down at him and watched as he pulled the blankets up to his chest and stared up at me with his icy gray eyes, I couldn't bring myself to scold him. I was just glad that he was okay, and I wanted to take care of him. "I'll get you some tea," I said quietly. I turned on my heel and walked out of the room, then made my way over to the kitchen to put the kettle on. Selena was still giving the doctor the remainder of Edric's leftover pill bottles by the front door, and I could overhear him giving her strict instructions on how to keep an eye on him to make sure that he didn't try anything else to sleep, such as illicit drugs or too much alcohol. While they talked, I prepared a pot of chamomile tea and waited for the water to boil. I tried to reach out to my wolf again to see if she was feeling better, but still got no response. She seemed to be sleeping again, and when she stirred a bit, it wasn't for long. This made me nervous. I decided then and there that if this went on for too much longer, I would have to figure out why this was happening. I still figured that it was just the pregnancy, but I couldn't be too sure. Suddenly, Selena came into the kitchen and saw that I was preparing Edric tea. I had even begun to make breakfast for the two of us without fully realizing it. Even I was exhausted after the night before and the whole ordeal from that morning. "You look tired," Selena said with a sigh. "Let me take care of Ella today." I shook my head and stifled a yawn. "It's okay, I won't make you do that." Selena frowned as she looked at me. "Nonsense. Besides, Edric needs someone to keep an eye on him. Doctor's orders, and that person might as well be you." A little while later, I returned to Edric's room with a tray laden with tea and breakfast. He was no longer in bed when I walked in, which caused me to panic for a moment until I heard the bathroom door open. Steam poured out of the bathroom as he walked out, drying his hair with a towel. He was only wearing his pajama pants with no shirt, and I felt myself blush as I set the tray down on the bed. "I'm really fine," Edric said. "You don't need to go to all of this effort." "It's the doctor's orders," I replied. "Just eat your breakfast and don't complain." I thought I saw a bit of a smile flash across Edric's lips, and I couldn't help but smile a bit too. "Well, thanks," Edric said quietly as he sat down on the bed and picked up a cup of tea. "I do appreciate it. I appreciate you." Edric's words made my face turn a deep shade of scarlet red. Without a word, I nervously sat down across from him and joined him in eating breakfast in bed. However, after our argument from the night before, the air between us was awkward and silent as we ate. Finally, after several minutes of eating without a single word said between the two of us, Edric opened his mouth to speak. Part of me thought that he was going to apologize, but instead he pointed at the TV. "Want to watch a movie while we eat? I found a good one that I think you'll like." Sure," I replied. Edric nodded and turned on the television, then turned on the movie. Much to my surprise, it was a romantic comedy. Edric had never struck me as a movie watcher, let alone someone who liked romantic comedies. But soon enough, I found myself laughing alongside him. In fact, when we finished the movie, Edric suddenly jumped up and ran out of the room, only to return a few minutes later with his arms full of snacks. He threw the bags of popcorn and chips down on the bed like a little kid who had just raided the pantry, and put on another comedy movie. It was odd seeing this side of him after our argument from the night before. Edric never brought it up or apologized for it, but in a way, I almost felt as though this was his way of trying to make it up to me. I even caught him looking at me sheepishly on more than one occasion, as though he knew that he had hurt my feelings the night before and that he had scared the hell out of me that morning. As we laughed and ate too many snacks, watching movies well into the night, it reminded me of the night that we had watched the live comedy show at the networking event. I remembered how much I loved seeing him laugh loudly and naturally that night, and that was what he did tonight. The sound of his laughter filled the air, and regardless of everything that was said during our argument, and regardless of what had happened that morning, I couldn't help but smile as well. Somehow we managed to spend the entire day and all evening laying in bed and watching movies. Once Edric knew that Ella was asleep, he sneakily ordered food to be delivered to the penthouse. We spent the rest of the evening eating takeout burgers and laughing at more funny movies, and soon enough I found myself not thinking about our argument or his accidental overdose at all. In fact, that night, I fell asleep on Edric's chest as the movie played, and just before I slipped off into sleep, I felt his arm gently wrap around me, and I felt his lips kiss my forehead. I pretended to be asleep and hid my expression. But secretly, I was still hurt over what Edric had said the night before. And now, I hoped that I wasn't just a sleeping pill or a live-in caretaker to him. Moana. The rest of the weekend went by too quickly. I spent all of Sunday with Ella to make up for not seeing her on Saturday, and soon enough Monday morning came around. However, I noticed something over the weekend as well as the first few days of the week. Mina's sleepiness wasn't getting any better. In fact, it only seemed to be getting worse, and it was making me nervous. At first, I thought it was just the pregnancy, but now I was beginning to think otherwise. And in fact, there was something especially odd about it. Mina seemed to get better at nighttime. She still had very little energy during that time, but it was an obvious improvement nonetheless. This slightly heightened energy would go on through the night and the early morning, but then she would get extremely sleepy again whenever I drank my morning coffee. By Thursday, I was beginning to get suspicious. I decided then to try an experiment. On Thursday morning, I decided not to drink my morning coffee. "Good morning," Selena said as I walked into the kitchen. I was already dressed for work, and Ella was already sitting at the kitchen counter and eating her toast and eggs before school. I kissed Ella on top of her head and smiled at Selena, who had just placed a plate of breakfast down for me. But when I sat down, I saw that my coffee was there. I subtly pushed it away and ate my breakfast without mentioning it, but Selena noticed that the cup was untouched as I finished eating and stood up to get ready to leave. "You didn't like your coffee?" she asked, looking a bit confused. "I thought you loved your morning coffee." "I do," I replied with a nonchalant smile. "I'm just not in the mood for coffee this morning, I'm afraid." Selena looked at me for a moment, then nodded and poured the cup of coffee down the sink. I felt a bit bad for wasting it, but I needed to find out if the coffee had something to do with my wolf's sleepiness. Maybe the caffeine was interacting strangely with my body due to the pregnancy. Edric was waiting for Ella and I in the foyer when we walked out. He smiled at us as the elevator doors opened, but what he said in the elevator baffled me. "I heard you didn't want your coffee this morning." I couldn't help but raise an eyebrow and look at Edric with a bit of confusion. Why did it seem as though both Selena and Edric were overly concerned about whether I drank my coffee or not that morning? "Yeah," I said as the elevator doors opened to the lobby and we stepped out. "I didn't want the caffeine this morning." Edric almost seemed a little bit put off by that, which I thought was strange. However, he didn't bring it up again, and instead had pleasant conversation with Ella and myself as we walked to school. By the time we arrived and waved goodbye, I had almost forgotten about it. However, as I taught my classes that day, I noticed that Mina's energy was indeed higher than it had been recently. In fact, by the time school was out and I walked out of the school with Ella, Mina's energy seemed almost normal again. Maybe it was just the caffeine interacting poorly with my body because of the pregnancy. "Hi, Daddy," Ella said as we walked up to meet him. Edric grinned and crouched down to let Ella climb up onto his shoulders. As he stood once more, however, I noticed something. He was holding a smoothie in his hand. "Here," he said with a smile, holding the smoothie out for me. "I got you something. It's hot out, so I thought this might be refreshing for you after working all day." "Oh," I replied, taking the cold smoothie cup out of his hand. "Thank you." "Daddy, did you get a smoothie for me?" Ella asked. Edric sighed and shook his head. "I'm sorry, Princess," he replied. "I forgot. We'll pass the smoothie cart on the way back, so I'll get you one. Okay?" "She can have mine," I said, holding the cup back out. "I don't really need it." Suddenly, Edric's face changed in an unexpected way, and his eyes widened. "No," he said, almost shouting. My own eyes went wide. I was taken aback by Edric's insistence and stared up at him confusedly. "Well, why not?" I asked, looking down at the large smoothie cup. "I don't mind sharing. Heck, all three of us could share. It's a big cup." Edric went silent for a moment. He kept opening and closing his mouth, as though he was trying to come up with something to say. Seeing him like this made me nervous, and I couldn't help but think back on Edric's strange obsession with my coffee that morning. I looked back down at the smoothie cup, then and started to have an odd feeling in the pit of my stomach. "I just don't think that Ella would like that flavor," Edric said with a smile. "Besides, it's yours. If you can't finish it, that's okay." With that, Edric began to walk with Ella on his shoulders. I watched after him for a moment before catching up, but I couldn't stop wondering what his deal was today. But the longer I thought about it, the more I figured that he was just having an off day. Maybe he still felt bad about what he had said on Friday night and was trying to make it up to me. And besides, it was incredibly hot out that day, and the smoothie did look cold and refreshing. I decided to take a sip and found it surprisingly delicious. In fact, I had drunk half of it by the time we stopped at the smoothie cart to get her own, and I had finished it by the time we got home. As we took the elevator back up to the penthouse, Edric noticed my empty cup and almost seemed to relax a little bit. And within the hour, I was pretty certain that I realized why. Something was in that smoothie. It's because Mina's energy suddenly dropped again. Had Edric been putting something in my coffee, and when he noticed that I didn't want my coffee that morning, he put something in that smoothie? But why would he do that? Selena had made a comment about my coffee that morning, too. Was she in on it as well? After dinner, I quickly excused myself to my room to think. I paced for a while before suddenly freezing, my eyes widening. Olivia. I had nearly forgotten about my conversation with her. I had come to the conclusion that she was being paid to spread lies about Edric, but now... What if she had the same experience as I did? If Olivia had similar symptoms while she was living with Edric, then it would be extremely concerning. I needed to know if someone was trying to drug me and why they would do that, but I couldn't just walk up to Edric or Selena and ask. As I thought back on my conversation with Olivia, I remembered that she had given me her business card, and when I quickly rifled through my purse, it was still there. I held the business card in my shaky hand, wondering if I should call her Moana. As I held Olivia's business card in my shaking hand, I wondered if I should call her. I needed to know if she, too, had experienced these sort of strange occurrences. Although I couldn't imagine why Edric would ever want to give me something that would make my wolf sick, if someone really was intentionally poisoning me, then I needed to get out and get my baby to safety. However, I still had no way of knowing for sure, and I was afraid to ask Edric or Selena about my wolf's symptoms in case either of them were in on it and got suspicious of me. But I still couldn't be sure. Not only was I unsure of the situation with my wolf, but I was also still unsure of Olivia. I still couldn't help but wonder if she really was an actress hired by Michael or someone else to get between Edric and I. And so with a sigh, I slipped the business card back into my purse and decided not to call her yet. After all, Edric had never really given me a reason not to trust him, right? However, as the night went on, I found myself unable to sleep. Edric was staying up late in his study, and as I laid in his big king-sized bed in his dark bedroom, I kept tossing and turning relentlessly. The whole situation with the coffee that morning, followed by the smoothie, was suspicious to say the least. My first conversation with Olivia kept swirling around my head, and I couldn't forget the fact that Edric had stolen my wolf tooth at one point. And the worst part about it was that I couldn't even talk to my wolf, who was normally a voice of reason, because she was too sleepy to even hear me. I felt alone. Finally, I decided that I couldn't sleep without contacting Olivia. If I really was being poisoned, and if it really was dangerous, then I couldn't risk another day of practically being force-fed whatever was making my wolf sleepy. And if Edric or Selena got too suspicious, then I had no way of knowing what other sorts of methods they would try to give me the poison. While Edric was still in his study, I quietly made my way to my room and retrieved the business card from my purse. I held it for a moment, reading the number in the dim light of my bedroom, before I took a deep breath and punched her number into my phone. "Hi, Olivia," I typed. "It's Moana. Can we talk? It's important." When I hit send, the deep breath that I had taken in finally came out. I hid the business card back in my purse and quickly made my way back to Edric's room. And by the time I got to his room, my phone buzzed already. "Sure thing," Olivia's text replied. "I've been meaning to show you something, actually. Let's meet up for coffee on Sunday?" On Sunday morning, I prepared to meet Olivia for our conversation. Leading up to that morning, I had hidden the fact that I wasn't drinking my morning coffee. Lo and behold, Mina's energy came back almost completely. Edric and Selena didn't seem to notice that I was secretly pouring my coffee down the sink when they weren't looking, and by now I was almost entirely certain that they were, in fact, putting something in my coffee. There was no doubt about it. The way that my wolf's energy perked up whenever I didn't drink my morning coffee was too distinct to think otherwise. Of course, I was still paranoid about anything else I ate or drank that had been prepared for me, but thankfully, nothing other than the coffee seemed to be causing the issues. That morning, I got dressed to meet with Olivia. I wore something nondescript and casual, a pair of jeans and a light jacket, since the weather was cooling down now with autumn just around the corner, which was quite different from what I normally wore and would hopefully keep people from noticing me easily. The night before, I had already told Selena and Edric that I planned on going out on Sunday morning. When they asked where I was going, I simply said that I was having coffee with an old friend from college who was visiting town. Once I was dressed, I inspected myself in the mirror for a moment before taking in a deep breath and steadying my nerves, then headed out into the living room. Edric was sitting in the armchair when I came out. He looked over at me, seemingly taking in my appearance, and shot me a slight smile. "You look nice." "Oh," I smiled weakly. "Thank you." Edric looked at me for another moment before returning to his newspaper. "Make sure to bring the driver with you," he said. "And maybe you should wear a surgical mask. It makes me nervous that you're going out in public alone now that people know who you are." I nodded hesitantly. Although I hated that I had to hide my identity in order to feel safe, I couldn't deny the fact that Edric was right. The media attention since Edric had announced our relationship had died down a bit, but the paparazzi were still roaming around like tigers pacing their cages in the zoo. Even when Edric and I walked to school with Ella during the week, we occasionally got bombarded by cameras and annoying questions. And now, I especially didn't need to garner any attention lest Edric find out that I was meeting up with Ella's supposedly dead mother. "Sure," I replied. I fished a blue surgical mask out of my purse and held it up with a smile. "Got it right here." Edric, without looking up from his newspaper, nodded. "Well, have a nice time," he said. "Thanks," I said, trying to sound as nonchalant as possible. It was difficult, though, knowing that I was about to meet up with someone that would likely make Edric feel incredibly angry if he found out about it. "I'll be back soon." With that, I stiffly walked out of the living room and stepped into the elevator. On my way down, I did wind up putting on the surgical mask. I put on my sun hat as well to hide my distinct hair. However, when I walked out into the lobby, there was one bit of advice that I didn't take from Edric. I decided not to have the driver take me. After all, I didn't need the driver revealing any information about who I was meeting up with. I didn't know whether the driver knew Olivia, or even if he relayed all sorts of information back to Edric. I needed this to be as discreet as possible, because if Edric really was poisoning me for whatever reason, I would need to escape safely with my baby. If he knew too much, then there was a good chance that I would never escape. Therefore, I walked out onto the street and took a right down the sidewalk, keeping my head down so as not to be noticed by the driver or anyone else. Moana. A little while later, after walking a few blocks through the city, I arrived at the coffee shop where Olivia and I planned to meet. It was a small, nondescript coffee shop that didn't appear to be well known, which would be helpful in keeping our meeting secret. When I stepped into the little coffee shop, I looked around and didn't see Olivia yet. "Can I get you anything?" the barista behind the counter, a bored-looking teenage girl, asked. Just an iced latte," I replied, fishing through my purse for my wallet. The barista lazily made my drink and handed it to me, and I gave her the money before sitting down. I made sure to sit away from the window, just in case anyone would see me with Olivia. A few minutes passed, and finally the bell on the door rang as someone came in. It was Olivia. She shot me a stiff smile and ordered her own coffee before sitting down across from me. Although we had planned to act nonchalant, as though we were just old friends meeting up to chat, I found it difficult to feel natural as I sat across from the spitting image of Ella. She seemed to look even more like Ella now, with her hair pulled back in a slightly messy ponytail, and she was wearing a plain shirt and jeans. I could see why Edric would have liked Olivia, but it was all the more confusing knowing that he had claimed that she was dead. "How is everything going?" Olivia asked, keeping her voice low. I didn't know where to begin. Already, I could feel my voice beginning to shake. Olivia, somehow noticing this, smiled and reached across the table to give my arm a squeeze. "Is he hurting you?" I shook my head vigorously. "No, he's been wonderful. On the outside, at least. But I've been feeling as though he's up to something, and I don't know what." Olivia nodded slowly and pulled her hand away. She didn't seem surprised in the slightest. "Tell me everything." Taking a deep breath, I began to speak. "First of all, I know that this isn't public knowledge, but you need to know for the context of the story. I'm a werewolf and not a human. I didn't know myself until recently, when my wolf suddenly began to manifest. But lately, I've been noticing that my wolf has been feeling strange and tired. At first, I thought that it was just my pregnancy hormones or something, but then I noticed that it was always worse after I had my morning coffee. So the other day, I decided not to drink it, and I noticed that my wolf felt better. But Edric noticed too, and when he picked me up from work later, he had a smoothie for me, which is sort of random." "Did you drink the smoothie?" Olivia asked, to which I nodded. "What happened?" The symptoms came back within a couple of hours, and Edric was weird about it. It was like he was insisting on me drinking it. Ella wanted some, and when I offered to give her a sip, he suddenly freaked out. As I spoke, Olivia's eyes slowly began to widen. I could instantly tell from the expression on her face that she had experienced the same thing, or had at least experienced something very similar when she lived with Edric. "You haven't been drinking anything else they've given you, right?" Olivia asked, leaning across the table a bit and looking at me intensely. I shook my head. "No," I replied, "and I've been feeling better. My wolf's energy is back up." Olivia seemed to let out a small sigh of relief. "Have you noticed any other strange occurrences?" I furrowed my brow, thinking for a moment, before I remembered the incident with the wolf tooth, as well as something else. Something tiny that I didn't think much of at the time. But now it felt as though every little thing was evidence of a conspiracy. "Well, first of all, I have this wolf tooth." I pulled it out. Ever since the initial incident, I had been keeping it in my purse and slid it across the table for Olivia to see. I showed it to Edric when he found out that I was a werewolf. He started acting strange about it, though. He seemed to look at it intensely when I showed it to him, and he said that it's an alpha tooth. But that's not all. A little while later, right after I met you, actually, he stole it. Olivia gingerly picked up the tooth, turning it over in her hand. Her eyes widened when I said that Edric stole it. "Why did he do that?" she asked quietly. I shrugged. He just said that he was taking it to have it analyzed so he could see whether it was an alpha tooth or not. Of course, it made me think about what you told me, that he's only interested in producing alpha heirs. I nodded slowly. There was a long silence as Olivia inspected the tooth carefully before she handed it back to me. But I wasn't finished. "There's something else," I said. "Maybe it's nothing. But on the same morning that he had taken the tooth, I found a pair of scissors on his bedside table, and he was gone when I woke up. Like I said, maybe it's nothing, but—" Olivia's eyes suddenly went even wider than before. "Check your hair," she said. I furrowed my brow. "What?" "Your hair," she continued. "Is any of it missing, like it's been cut? Check underneath where you'd be less likely to notice." A slight chuckle escaped my lips, but Olivia didn't seem to be joking. My smile faded and I slowly raised my hand to grope around on the underside of my hair. I didn't notice anything at first, until my eyes widened. "There's a shorter piece, isn't there?" Olivia asked, to which I nodded slowly. On the underside of my hair there was a shorter piece than the rest. When I pulled it out and brought it around to look at it, I could tell that it had been cut, judging from how straight and perfect the chunk was, making it obvious that it hadn't grown like that naturally. Olivia's face darkened and she shut her eyes for a moment, sighing. "I knew it," she whispered. "What is it?" I asked, feeling my voice shake. "What does all of this mean?" Olivia shook her head and passed her hand over her face. "I have no way of knowing for sure, but all of the signs are pointing to him going to a witch. I think he's slipping potions into your coffee." My blood ran cold at Olivia's words. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing would come out for a long time, as the shock of it all made it feel as though my throat closed up. Why would Edric want to do something like that? Suddenly, Olivia dug into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She opened it, then slid it across the table for me to look at. It was an old newspaper clipping about a woman who had been found dead. "What's this?" I asked quietly, picking up the newspaper. Olivia didn't answer, but she didn't need to. As I read the article, I got the answer I was looking for. "Just this week, a local beta woman was found dead," the article read. "Although her cause of death is unknown, one thing is for certain. Just a few months prior to this event, this woman, whose family have decided to keep her name anonymous for personal reasons, was discovered to have given birth to a son. According to birth records, the newborn son's father is none other than alpha billionaire and CEO of WareCorp, Michael Morgan. While Mr. Morgan has not given a statement at this time, some are speculating that he or his wife, Verona Morgan, may have had something to do with the mystery woman's death, as this child was the result of an extramarital affair. Of course, this is all speculation." By the time I finished reading, my hands were shaking violently. I unintentionally dropped the newspaper article, allowing it to flutter down to the table as I covered my mouth with my shaking hand. Meanwhile, Olivia only looked back at me with a look of sadness and concern drawn across her face. "That's not all," she said. "Moana." "That's not all," Olivia said, looking at me with a sickening combination of sadness and concern on her face that only filled me with dread. I had already just read that a woman, who was likely Ethan's mother, judging from the information in the newspaper article, had died under mysterious circumstances around the Morgan family. Not only that, but I had discovered that it was very likely that Edric had taken my wolf tooth and a lock of my hair to a witch, and he was now putting some sort of potion in my morning coffee. I couldn't fathom why he would want to do that, but now that I had read the newspaper article about Ethan's mother, I was beginning to wonder if that poor woman had met a fate that I was bound to meet if I continued being poisoned. And now, before I could even process all of this, Olivia was saying that she had something else to reveal to me, as though there was even possibly anything else that could add another layer to this twisted mess. "What else is there?" I whispered, my voice shaking just as much as my hands. Olivia, with a sigh, reached into her purse again and retrieved something else. It was another folded piece of paper. She hesitated with it in her hands, then looked up at me. "Can I see the tooth again?" she asked. I froze for a moment, then nodded and handed it back to her. As I did, she opened the folded piece of paper to reveal what looked to be a page ripped out of a book. She put both of the objects in the center of the table. The page had an illustration of a wolf tooth on it with text all around. Immediately, I could see two words that stuck out to me: golden wolf. And now that my own wolf tooth was laying next to the illustration, they looked eerily similar. "You're the golden wolf, Moana," Olivia said. She was whispering now, as though she didn't want anyone to overhear a single word of what she was saying. It instantly transported me back to the night that Ethan told me about the story of the golden wolf and how people would hunt the golden wolf if it was real. But that was just a fairy tale. I let out a wry chuckle and shook my head. "Very funny," I replied, sitting back in my chair. "But I know that that's just a story for kids." Olivia just stared back at me with a serious expression on her face. My smile slowly faded, and my eyes started to widen. "It's true," she said, pushing the illustration a little closer to me and tapping on a specific paragraph. "Look here. The golden wolf will manifest as a pure soul who is thought to be human. They will possess a single tooth, the only link to their true lineage. That's you, Moana. Everything that you told me points to this. And the tooth that you have you looked at it in the moonlight, by any chance?" I shook my head, still too shocked to speak. "Try it tonight," Olivia said quietly. "It'll glow a golden color, but only in the moonlight. I promise you, it's true." I didn't know what to say. All along, I thought that this was nothing but a fairy tale meant to entertain kids, not a true story. And yet, the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. And it made me wonder, "Do you think that Edric knows?" I whispered. Olivia nodded slowly. "I think so," she replied. "He may have known from the beginning. For all we know, he knew that you were the golden wolf when he met you, and that was why he got you pregnant. It all lines up too perfectly with his agenda to produce the best heirs possible. How did you two meet, anyway?" I was just walking down the street and we ran into each other," I said, not wanting to go into the full details of our fateful encounter. "And you think that that was just pure coincidence, for you to just randomly run into an extremely famous alpha CEO in the middle of the street one day?" Olivia said. My eyes widened. "But I think Edric is my mate," I replied. "I thought that was why. I thought it was fate." Olivia shrugged and leaned back in her chair. "Maybe. But do you know for certain that he's your mate? Or is that just what he told you?" Olivia's words made me think deeply. I had thought that he was my mate, and my wolf seemed to think so as well. But then again, with the way that my wolf had been so sleepy lately, I had absolutely no way of knowing now. For all I knew, Edric was giving me potions to hide the fact that he wasn't my mate. "I don't know," I whispered, feeling hot tears beginning to prick at the backs of my eyes. "I don't know what's real and what isn't anymore." With a sigh, Olivia reached across the table again and squeezed my hand once more. When I looked up at her, I could see a soft, gentle expression on her pretty face. "That was how I felt too," she said quietly. "For months, I had no idea what to think or who to trust. But you can trust me, and I don't want to see you get hurt. I had never thought that Edric would hurt me, but now I wasn't so sure. What if he just planned on producing a child of the golden wolf, and then he was going to discard me in the same way that his father had discarded Ethan's mother? What if the potions would keep me from being able to fight back and defend myself?" Finally, I looked back at Olivia with tears in my eyes. "Thank you for telling me the truth," I whispered. Olivia nodded, still holding my hand across the table. "If you ever want to escape," she said, "I'm just a phone call away. I can get you out of there." Olivia and I finished our conversation and parted ways. She left first, and as I watched her walk down the street through the window of the coffee shop, I couldn't help but think that maybe I should take her up on her offer. All of the signs right at that moment pointed to Edric being up to something sinister. Olivia was right. My first encounter with Edric had been too perfect, almost as though it was planned. And although I had been beginning to think that it was fate bringing two mates together, I was beginning to think otherwise now. However, I needed more evidence first before I jumped into anything. I needed to know for sure that Edric was up to something before I potentially made a mistake by trusting the wrong person. But I did know one thing for sure. If I decided to take Olivia up on her offer and run away, I was going to bring Ella along with me so that I could reunite mother and daughter once more.